According to the UNHCR, the number of human lives living as refugees has more than doubled in the past 10 years, going from roughly 10 million souls in 2008 to 24 million lives as of 2021. This number is vast and staggering, and it has been important enough to shape the presidential politics of the United States of America over the past decade. The issue of people fleeing dire poverty, violence, and persecution remains one of the most significant challenges of our lifetimes. And several years ago, one young Iranian Kurd fled persecution in Iran and set out to join those millions seeking safety in Australia, or so he had hoped. After a long and dangerous journey, his story was stopped. He was detained by the Australian government on Christmas Island and then shipped along with thousands of other asylum seekers to Manus Island off Papua New Guinea. There, he was imprisoned indefinitely in a camp that was custom designed to break the human spirit and force detainees into stepping forward for voluntary repatriation. Behrouz Boochani was one soul among millions. But then, something remarkable happened. This former journalist obtained a smuggled mobile phone, and that phone connected him to the outside world. And soon, message by message, text by text, Behrouz Boochani would become known to the world as the voice of Manus, shedding a light into the black box that was his prison camp, and turning a dull statistic into a very human story of pain, struggle, sacrifice, and determination. Against all odds, with the help of journalists, publishers, allies in the prison camp, and caring people around the world, Behrouz would go on to distill that experience into No Friends But the Mountains, Writings from Manus Prison, a searing, angry, emotional, and moving testimony over a life stopped and held in limbo. By the time he would finish his book, 6 years would pass, and 8 men would have died in detention, including his close friend Reza Barati. Indeed, Behrouz released his book while still detained on Manus Island, and from the small confines of the compound assigned to him, he would join conferences from around the world to talk about his book, his experience, and the plight of many others like him on Manus, scattered across the world. He would never reach Australia as he first dreamed. Now, free for almost a year and a half in New Zealand, I am honored to have the privilege to speak to Behrouz Boochani about his life and work on No Friends But the Mountains. For this conversation with Behrouz, I am deeply honored to be joined by my first ever co-host, Cliff W. Gilmore, my friend and colleague. Cliff specializes in strategic communications, crisis communications, and media relations, and I am fortunate to be his neighbor here in Santa Fe and call him a friend. I dedicate this episode to my friends and colleagues from Afghanistan, now either living as refugees around the world or in fear in Taliban-held Afghanistan. I now would like to invite you to join my co-host Cliff W. Gilmore and myself as we speak to the former voice of Manus Island and author of No Friends But the Mountains, Behrouz Boochani. I would first like to welcome everyone back to this podcast, The Ask. I am your host, Weiss Azimi, and today I'm joined for the first time ever by a co-host. I'd like to welcome my colleague and friend, Cliff W. Gilmore, to the podcast. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thanks, Wes.
And I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to our guest, Behrouz Boochani. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you for having me.
This is, as far as I'm concerned, an important milestone for my podcast. I was talking with my colleague Cliff just earlier about how I've had the opportunity over the course of the production of this podcast to interview authors, to interview filmmakers and activists. And in this conversation with you, I have the unique privilege of talking to someone who has all three of those backgrounds. You have a background as a filmmaker. Choka, please tell us the time.
Yeah.
And obviously you have a long background as a published journalist, and you also have a background as a literary author. But I think what makes this conversation so unique and so important for this podcast is the fact that this is the first time ever I'll have the opportunity to interview someone who represented a movement. And for several years of your life, you were known as the voice of Manus, representing the hopes and dreams of thousands of young men, women, and indeed children who had ended up in Manus indefinitely, imprisoned there. And so for that fact, I'm incredibly honored and privileged to have you here for this discussion. Thank you so much, Behrouz.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's my pleasure.
And with that, I'll toss off the first question to my colleague, Cliff.
Behrouz, and we're getting repetitive in our thanks, but first and foremost, thanks so much for joining us, the opportunity to talk, and really to hopefully expose some of your thoughts, ideas, and experiences out to continue moving to different audiences. Not all of our listeners will be familiar with you, and I certainly don't want to rehash your entire experience, but I was wondering if you would be willing to open with a bit about talking of origins, the kinds of things that took you to what I presume is a difficult decision to leave your home and seek refuge elsewhere. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I'm from Iran, but I'm Kurdish. So I born in Kurdistan in west of Iran. And generally, I think that, Kurdish people, we are fighting against colonialism system in Iran. We are colonized. And that's why I grew up in that culture. I grew up with that resistance culture in Kurdistan. The main reason that I left Iran in 2013 was exactly because of my work as a cultural activist, mostly, and a journalist in Iran. We were working to keep Kurdish culture alive and to educate people, to teach people that how is important that they keep the culture alive, and especially language. So I left Iran because of that, because they arrested some of my colleagues. So I had to leave Iran. I went to Indonesia, and after about 2 months, I went to Australia by boat. And when I arrived there, they just arrested me and banished me to Manus Island in north of Papua New Guinea, in the middle of Pacific Ocean. So I was there in an indefinite prison camp for exactly 6 years. And after 6 years, I ended up in New Zealand. Of course, the work that I did and I'm doing is about refugees and how to expose the system through my articles, through my journalism works, and this book that we are talking about, and the movie and other artistic works.
Behrouz, it is such an incredible choice to make, to leave behind your home, your family, and your friends. It's the hardest decision I think a person can make. It's not a decision that people make lightly. It represents a break from everything that you knew, everything that you might be. It means leaving behind your parents and your siblings. This is something that you did. And you touched on the reason why you had to make this decision as a Kurd in Iran. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the obstacles Kurds face in Iran? I understand that your ethnic group is spread throughout that part of the world. There are Kurds in Iraq, there are Kurds in Syria, there are Kurds around Turkey and Iran too. And because of that, even though you are a people without a state. That goes back to even the title of your book, No Friends But the Mountains. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what it meant for you growing up, knowing your identity and knowing how that identity would come into conflict with the fact that you were growing up and becoming a person in Iran.
Yeah, I think that is a very good question, because in my first my introduction, I mentioned that because it's very important, because that impacts and effect on my work in Manus Island. So because the policy towards the refugees in Australia is established on colonialism mentality, and it's very related to history of colonialism in Australia. And I, as a Kurd, I grew up in with that resistance culture against a different structure, but same mentality, colonialism mentality. So that's why it's important for understanding my work in Manus Island. I think it's very important that we look at my background as a Kurd. What's happening in Manus Island, I just borrow resistance culture in Kurdistan and reproduce it in Manus Island against a different system, but same mentality. So that's why I think it's important. So in Kurdistan, Kurdish people are about 14 million people in the Middle East. So it is just a land, and this land divided between 4 countries. So that is not my issue, that we should be independent or not. That is not my matter. What is important is that Kurdish people are facing assimilation. Kurdish people are facing a brutal system in Iran, particularly in Iran, and how the system designed to take our identity, to destroy our identity. For example, language, Kurdish language is not part of education system in the universities, in official platforms, in the media, everywhere. This language is marginalized, and also any cultural elements of Kurdish people are marginalized. And it's not only Kurdish people, we have Arab people, Turkish people, Gilak people, Lorish people, many ethnic people in Iran, and all of them are dominated by Farsi language with the Persian culture. And that's why I think it's very important that we see this background, and look at Kurdish people and history of resistance in Kurdistan, that how Kurdish people are resisting in front of the system. And exactly that's happened for refugees, that's happened for marginalized people, for indigenous people, for minorities, that all of minorities are actually struggling with the same mentality. It is a mechanism of power, that how you challenge this mechanism of power, how you challenge a system which designed to take your identity. That's why, of course, anything that I do is very related to my background as a Kurd.
I would like to just make a quick observation here. You talk about the source of the crisis you confronted as a young man that drove you to leave Iran, the fact that you were a persecuted minority, occurred. And one thing that I think is so remarkable about you is how expansive you are about the issue of persecution. You don't only talk about the need to help Kurds. You talk about people from across the world. I've noted that you're very active on social media. You use your Twitter account to speak out about things that you feel strongly about across the world. And just in the last couple of months, I've noted you've spoken about the issue of anti-Semitism. You've spoken about the need to help Afghan refugees and other people across the world. You seem to take a very encompassing approach to your activism, and I applaud you for it.
What I really believe in, that the marginalized people, minorities, they should support each other. I think they can be more powerful. They can affect and challenge the system. As I before mentioned, everyone are facing a mechanism of power. Even women, feminism movement, I think, is important for us, that we work with this movement, we support this movement and get support from this movement, because it's everything is about mechanism of power. So that's why of course, I understand Afghan refugees, I understand Afghan people, and also I understand indigenous people in New Zealand, indigenous people in Australia, and all minorities who are fighting.
Behrouz, one of the things that stands out to me in reading through your work is just this underlying power of empathy. Your what you just expressed, that understanding where other people are coming from, and I've been struggling in like some of the language we use in the United States now is that path to being an ally, that path to understanding the systems of oppression, but also recognizing and acknowledging some of our own roles in it, complicity in some of those things that have really required me to try and learn how to be more empathetic. I think it's easy to think, we're good people, and I think of others, but it's been a challenge for me to realize where I wasn't really understanding other people. And your works certainly are a tool to help with that and to help open some of those doors. And so often then we see things through our own lenses. We don't even understand our own lenses, is what I'm learning about myself. It's one of those things that's so painfully obvious when you finally see it and realize that others have been looking at you going, yeah, you're not seeing it. But as I've moved forward in that quest for empathy myself, I found that in your work, and an area where I found strength was that I've been through some times where there are extended periods of uncertainty, where the systems or people who were there to help were either opaque, if not outright resistant. And you went through a period of time of uncertainty and not knowing what was next, that truly just it squeezes my heart. But I think you seem to have come through it with a strength that I'm curious if you would be able to share in a bit of how would you tell other people, or what would you tell other people to do, or how would you help other people get through those periods of uncertainty? If my question makes sense, I don't.
I think we should look at the context, that you say on uncertainty. So I mentioned the title of the book, Choka, please, the movie, Choka, please tell us the time. That time is important in that context, because we are talking about an indefinite camp. When you are living in that context, that situation, that circumstances, you don't know what will happen. You don't know how long you will stay there. And exactly that is the heart of the system, this systematic torture, because you don't know. And when you don't know how long you will stay there and where you will end up, what will happen for you, I think that is a big torture. And that was our main question for many years that we asked from system, that how long we stay in this prison. And they didn't answer because they didn't want to answer, because they were aware of it, that when you live in that circumstances, condition, you feel torture. I think that is really important, that how playing with time is a torture, or using time as a tool for torturing people. So in that, really, it's really difficult question as well, that how we work in that situation, how we stay strong, how you support others, how you even share your work and continue to work. That is, I think, that comes from creativity. When you write in that circumstances, when you create something, when you feel and you are sure that you are challenging the system, or you are going to challenge the system by this work that you are writing, I think that make you stronger, to continue, because you are aware of what you are doing. And I think in Manus Island, I knew what I am doing. Just recently we were in a conference we were invited in a conference with my colleague Arash Kamali Sarvastani, that we made the movie together. He is in Netherlands. He played a voice of me, a voice message that I sent to him on 2016.
Oh, wow.
And that voice actually amazed myself, that I say that on that time when we were about to make the movie Choka, I was saying in that voice that, Arash, this work is going to down to the history. This work should be in history. This work should expose this system. And I was talking like this, and that really, it was that amazed myself. And after the event, I asked Arash, I said, Arash, please send this voice to me. I want to have it. And I think in all those years, I was aware what I am doing. I was aware, and I was confident that what I am doing is important, and it will challenge the system. I was aware of that, and I was sure. So when you think like that, of course, even if you imagine that you die in that system, I didn't feel safe in that system. I could die easily by a small infection, a disease, or even the system, accident, I don't know. But I was sure what I am doing is going to challenge the system. But I know it's very difficult. When I look back, I cannot believe that I was working like that. No, I am a lazy person compared to Manus Island.
It's the strength of purpose that seems to have carried you is profound, Behrouz. I suspect you're told often, people compliment you and throw words like you're so strong and brave and those things, and that the actions that you did, they absolutely are. But I guess what I would want to share was just how profound that sense of purpose really is. That is a rarity, and it's concrete, and it's amazing.
I think that was just fighting to survive. When you are in a circumstances like that, you are just struggling to survive. I survived through writing, through my work. Otherwise, I don't think I couldn't survive. And this surviveness is not mean that I am alive. it's mean that I'm okay mentally. My brain still works like a normal person. My heart. I didn't become a worse person. Probably I became a better person, and that is just that happened through work.
Let's talk about the equipment that you had to protect yourself when you were in Manus. You talked about how creativity saved your mind. It saved your soul, the ability to write about it, your experience, the ability to express the pain that you were going through poetry and through your novel, No Friends But the Mountains. One of the most fascinating things that I read in your book was this crucial time in your life as a young Kurd growing up in Iran where you had a choice. You even wrote about this in the book. The book is ostensibly about you, right? But your name never comes up as the character, right? It's not overtly you, if that makes sense. But in the book, you talk about how at one point in your life, your hand drifted over towards the rifle. You had thought to join the Peshmerga and to fight for the rights of your people against oppression and tyranny. But at the same time, you also drifted towards the pen. And when it came to that competition between the rifle and the act of writing, you wrote within your book, No Friends But the Mountains, when you thought of the power of the pen, you got weak in the knees at the awesome power of the ability to resist through the written word. Could you please share with us how you navigated that, your young life, how you found yourself as a writer, even before you were imprisoned in Manus?
Yeah, I think that's part of the book that I described that moment that I had to choose between taking a pen and write and resist through writing or cultural activism or art, or just going to the mountains and take a gun and fight against that system. That moment I think is a remarkable moment, and that is not only for me. That happened for many young Kurdish people, that in one stage of their life they have to choose to stay in the city or go to the mountain and join Peshmerga and fight, because the system force you to do that, because you cannot have dialogue with the system. There is not a democratic space for you that you work in that way. It is a dictatorship system. So you should choose. You want to go to the mountain and fight, take a gun, or take a pen. I think that is not only my story. That is a story of many Kurdish young people. They should choose. That part of the book is not only about me, that represent many people.
And I would like to say that I think many people around the world, including the people that you were imprisoned with in Manus, are thankful for that choice that you made as a young man to pick up the pen. Think of what that provided you in your life, what that allowed you to fight for when you were on Manus, what that allowed you to create.
Behrouz, I'm interested actually in so many things, but there's a particular aspect of the book right there on the front where you have a dedication for Janet Galbraith, who is a bird. I'm curious personally, just more about that dedication and that person, and what is the connection there, and what can you tell us about Janet?
Yeah, I think people think that Janet is my lover, but yeah, but she's not my lover. She's my friend, and I think that because I respect Janet. Janet is a poet. She's an activist. She has been working for 2 decades in Australia. She support the indigenous movement in Australia. She support refugees, and she actually spent 2 decades of her life to fight against the system. So Janet was the first person that we were connected. On that time, in Manus Island, I smuggled the phone in, and I was in touch with Janet. And this bird actually come from, because sometimes we wrote poetry to each other. So always I said, and we were talking about the bird. I forgot the name of the bird. That this bird actually is flying between Manus Island and Pacific with Australia. At the summer, go there, winter, come back.
The Pacific Heron, that was the name of the bird.
Yeah. So Pacific Heron is like that. So we were talking like that. We created that connection. And I think the work that I wrote, I always describe them, the words, as a bird, that they were flying to Australia and get together and became a book. So when I wanted to acknowledge her work, appreciate her for what she has done, because she has done so much for refugees, for indigenous people. And just I wanted to dedicate the book to her. And just the first word that just, I think bird was a good word. And still I think that Janet is a bird.
When we talked earlier, you cited express purpose. That was the thing that kept you going and kept you focused. That another aspect that's coming through in your description is that connectivity, those relationships that sound like they helped carry you and keep you focused and looking forward into the unknown for quite some time. Thanks for sharing that with me. It was a curiosity as I looked through. Thank you.
Behrouz, from what I understand, when you first arrived in Manus, obviously the first thing was to survive, right? You came through a traumatic experience. Your first boat attempt to reach Australia, I think it sank, or I don't know what happened, but you were turned around, brought back to Indonesia. On your second attempt, the boat floundered and you were picked up, I think, by the Australian Navy and then initially brought to Christmas Island. All of this is in your book. All of it seizes the imagination and seizes the heart. And when you were first introduced to your prison on Manus Island, the first months were basically trying to survive and adapt to this incredibly alien and difficult environment. You then moved past survival and adaptation, and you began to find your voice. As you said, you were able to get your hand on a smuggled mobile phone and begin communicating with journalists around the world that wanted to know more about Australia's detention policy and what they were doing in the way of incarcerating migrants on Manus Island. And for the first chapter of your time in Manus, you went back to your roots as a journalist, the work that you did in Iran, and you produced news articles and opinion pieces about what was happening for the first time ever in Manus. That's why you were referred to as the voice of Manus. But at a certain moment within your imprisonment on Manus, something changed and you began to work on something unrelated to your journalism. This book, No Friends But the Mountains. And you've been on the record saying that there was a limit to what journalism could express about the experience of being a prisoner on Manus Island, and that your book, No Friends But the Mountains, became an outlet for everything that objective journalism could not capture for a reader. Could you share with us when you first had the idea of translating this experience into the book that became No Friends But the Mountains? When did you start work on the actual book itself while you were a prisoner?
Yeah, at the first day, I knew that I should expose this system. I should fight against this system. So I started to find a way and create a network. So that's why I smuggled the phone in and I just started to establish my network. I was thinking about a book, but I was not sure that this book I should write it in literature language or a journalism language. Which kind of language should I use? And probably on that time, just I was thinking about journalism. But when I started to publish my articles mostly in Guardian, of course, these articles, some of them got a good reaction. Make people aware of the situation. But after many years, I found out that doesn't work. People really don't know what I am talking about. Then I shifted my work and I focused on writing this book, and cinema as well. So I worked with other people. I participated in other projects. So that's why I think, and in the end, I think I was true because people know me through my book. And always I say that my movie is important than book. My other works, but people don't care. Just people want to know me through this book. That is interesting.
The range of artistic paths that you have chosen to reach out and to communicate and share is fantastic. I mean, the book is strong, and I've seen in the past other situations where people would do the one thing and it kind of gets them hooked in. The breadth and depth of your voice and the ways you've found to share that voice it's really something. Wise, I hope I don't sidetrack us much by jumping a bit on some of the questions we'd sort of mapped out. But if I can, Behrouz, on the beginning, we talked some of how you found using, that purpose was was one of the things that carried you through the uncertain times, the, not knowing when things would go and or when things would end would go. And then you were released and you did, I guess, go back to, I don't know if you can use air quotes in a podcast, but you went back to normal. I've had a few experiences where I left for quite some time. And in mine, it was very limited and surrounded by a framework of support. So I deployed for several times. And what I found was that it took me probably 2 months for home for every month while I was away before, on one occasion, my wife literally looked to me about 2 years after I'd been gone for a year and said, "You're finally home." That transition home is so challenging. So we talked on the end of how did you deal with the uncertainty and that purpose, and I think relationships that help carry you. How has that transition home been? What advice would you share or experience would you share with other people who are going through finally that return to normal? And normal is just such an inadequate word. We talked about the English language being inadequate. No. Normal is not the right word, but could you share with us about that?
I think that is very important question. Thank you very much for raising that, because, in the end, we should learn something from this experience. And I'm happy to share that experience. Something you cannot find it in the books, written. For me, I think answering this question has two sections. The first one is to be a refugee, what that means. What is the refugee's life experience? So when you are a refugee, I compare it with death, because you lose everything. You lose everything. You lose your parents, your job, your position, your friends, your city, the place you born, your lover, your opportunities. So you lose everything. You just go through a different world, a new world. When you become a refugee, at the first step, you lose your identity. You become identified as a refugee. So your identity is just a refugee. And it's really difficult to take your identity back. So that's why I describe refugees. Being refugee is like take a tree from a land and plant it in another land. So it takes time that this tree grew up again and become fresh again, and probably never that happened. Being a refugee is like that. You become disconnected, completely disconnected. So that is the first part of the answer, the question that we should really, that is how refugee is. But for me and for other refugees, I think when you come to a new society, which is a new world, you're born again, and it depends to the society is hosting you. It depends to your personality. It depends to your, even with your age. So if you be younger, it's easier to find your way compared to someone who is older. So it's very different. So each refugee has the same experience. And in my case, that is a different case. I didn't come from Iran just straight away to New Zealand. I went through different system for 6 years. More than 6 years I was in a prison. So of course, and even the way I came to New Zealand was different. For other refugees, when they arrive, just they meet a case manager or case worker or someone who helped them to settle down, to find a job, house, accommodation, But for me, it was different. When I came in the airport, many journalists were there. The mayor of the city was there. So, that is very different. So, of course, for me, in that point, that was very much easier to find my way in this country, because already many people knew me. So that is easier, that is easier to find a way to contribute to the society. But what about other refugees? And even for me, it's difficult. When I came, so people knew me. So that is really different. But generally, I want to say that it's really difficult. For me, it was difficult because I was in a prison and I just came out. And that was really difficult. It took a time for me that my body react, my body accept that I'm free, mentally accept that I'm free. I can go everywhere that I want. And that is not easy. That is a process. That is a process that takes time. But I think that is very important that I had some good friends in New Zealand. They really helped me. They were very supportive. That this support is not mean that people give you an accommodation or job. That support, it means you find a way to contribute to the society. I think that is very important. And you find a way to feel connection. You connect with the society. And we say, we Kurdish people, that being a Kurd is so difficult, but you have responsibility about it.
Mhm.
And being a refugee and a Kurd in the same time is really difficult. That makes it worse. That's how we grew up and how we learn to just resist.
Those constant themes of purpose and relationships, connectivity, all wrapped inside the empathy that you express. I mean, I marveled to hear you're sharing so freely and seeming naturally that other people had it harder. And those themes are powerful. And I think those can carry to an audience for this podcast, those ideas of whatever you're wrestling through, that you need that purpose and have those relationships to help sustain and support you. And then that empathy wrapped around of understanding what others are going through. Those things stand out in your story in a very powerful way. And again, thank you for sharing that story with me and that experience of that return to normal, which is such an inadequate phrase. Thank you, Behrouz.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we should really, particularly refugees, should write. Just through writing and in artistic way, we can educate people, help people like you to understand refugees.
I'll confess, I knew Manus is new to me as of when Wise asked me to join in this interview, and I got your book. And it's a painful level of ignorance to admit that something of that significance, I simply wasn't aware. And I can see the power of those folks who are in those situations, finding ways to share it and get that voice out. I'm so fortunate that I was finally on the receiving end of your voice.
To pick up the torch and to go back to process, you were talking about how you adjusted to life back in New Zealand, Behrouz, and that it didn't happen overnight, and that it wasn't easy, and that it was a process. And you also said, in response to this conversation with Cliff, that you believe it's important for all refugees to try and write, to find a voice, to express themselves. And I'd like to go back to that with your book. It was a massive effort. It took many years. You had to write your book in secret. You were not allowed to have mobile phones in the prison. Apparently, the guards would regularly sweep your room and look for contraband, including your phones. While you were writing this book, you did have your phone seized. It was a remarkable effort. And the result of this effort was striking. It is beautiful. Your book is beautifully written. And I would like to invite the readers into the world you illustrated by briefly reading a passage from your book, if I may. Childhood constitutes our very first battle. Childhood is a mythic tale, a complete epic. People are all born naked, born tiny, completely bare, exposed. One is always on a journey, a childhood that replicates death, forever intertwined with death, and always in perpetual flux. But I write my reflections as though I were an observer with a view from above, enabling me to cut through my experiences like a knife, cut through with aggression, with a tongue like a sword, cutting deep within oneself, cutting deep within, like those moments after waking from a nightmare depicting an arid and freezing night, a nightmare depicting life itself. The language seizes the reader. It seizes their imagination. It seizes the heart. We understood that the triumph of your book was accomplished between you, Monez Mansoubi, and Omed Tafigan. Could you please share with us how you three collaborated together to produce this work of both nightmare and beauty?
I think that my story, my work in Manus Island could be a different story. Probably I would write a different book if I wouldn't meet Munes and Omid and also other people that I work with. Definitely these people, Omid Tawfiq, he has done so much work. Sometimes I say that no one could translate this book. No one could make this book like this better than Omid because of his background, because of his knowledge, and his experience working with refugees. And he understands the detention industry in Australia. And of course, we were exchanging ideas. We affect on each other. We had dialogue and intellectual conversation to understand the system, to analyze the system. So of course, all of that happened, impact on this book. So I think that is very important, and recently I just focused on this concept, resistance knowledge, which created by the refugees in Manus Island, in Nauru, in Christmas Island. All of the refugees who have been resisting in front of this system. That resistance knowledge is not only created by the refugees, but with those people in Australia and people all around the world who have been a part of this resistance. They support them, they create work, they collaborate, work with them. So of course, it could be a very different story. Sometimes I say that I would write a different book.
Thank you for sharing that, Behrouz. I think you are, to go back to Cliff, very hard on yourself. You claim that without the contribution of your co-collaborators, Munez and Omed, that the book would be very different. I both understand, and I also kind of disagree, because I think that this is at the heart your story. But I do understand what you're saying in the way that the collaboration sweetened your words. It built on the foundation that you provided to the birds you were sending across the sea from Manus to Australia. I love the idea that you would send out a flock of birds when you could through your mobile phone, because that is in fact how the book was written, in short bursts where you would have the opportunity to sit down and react to what you were experiencing, or to capture something that you had witnessed as a prisoner on the island for the book. What I'd like to discuss with you next is the last chapter of your book. It's titled In Twilight, the Colors of War. Without giving too much away, this chapter describes a protest movement at Manus Prison that ends in an uprising, and a violent suppression of that uprising by GS4, the security company that had the contract to run the island on behalf of the Australian government, and also locals from the area. In the aftermath, an important character is revealed to have been slain, Reza, the gentle giant. There are obvious resemblances between the gentle giant and a real-life friend of yours named Reza, and it was inspired by the March 2014 protests at Manus Prison, this chapter. And that you wrote the final chapter of this book against the backdrop of this great unrest and violence. In fact, I have an article sitting somewhere here on my desk that actually has the WhatsApp exchanges between you and Omed as the riots were happening. Could you please share with us what went into writing this final chapter and why you chose to end the book here, considering that 2014 was sort of almost midway through your incarceration on the island, and a lot happened after 2014. Dramatic things, hunger strikes, more violence, more death. But you decided at this point in the work on this book that this is where it needed to end. Could you please share with us why No Friends But the Mountains ends here?
Yeah, I think many things happen in Manus Island that are not a part of this book. I didn't include them in the book, including hunger strike or many stories, because I already wrote these works. I recorded history of Manus Prison in my journalism works. And now we are working on a book. So this book is going to come out next year. This book is collection of my articles that I did in Manus Island. So we will have two books. I was sure that I recorded everything, because in articles I analyze the system. I look at the system from different aspect. That's why, I look at all of my works as a package. That's why I didn't want to include everything. But in the book, why it ended up in that chapter, I think just I wanted to show in the end that resistance that I'm talking about just ended up in a physical fight, because at the other chapters just I described the system. I said stories. So I wanted to just end it up in that. And a part of it is because probably I was tired to continue.
I just have a quick observation to make. I don't know if this is a conscious or subconscious thing for you, Behrouz, but perhaps one reason why you ended the book at the protest and riots is because of the death of your friend, Reza Barati, who you continue to write about to this day. In fact, there was an article as recently as 2018 where the headline reads, 4 years after Reza Barati's death, we still have no justice. Maybe that is one reason
Yeah,
why.
definitely. Of course, Reza was an important person, and I think people know Manus with his name. He's the first person who was killed in a very brutal way. Of course, I wanted to include him in the book and write about him. But why in the last chapter? That is a question. But of course, Reza was important for me because I know his background and we were friends. We were together. But in the book, of course, the last chapter, just I wanted to show how this system is brutal, and of course, for showing that brutality, just describe how Reza Barati was killed.
If I had a friend who was part of that experience with me and who was murdered and who faced injustice, I too would want to make sure that I built a monument to their sacrifice for all the reasons that you put forward. You, I think, have done something very special here in your book as far as commemorating not only the life of Reza Barati, but of thousands of people who shared your experience. After the struggle to write this book, I understand that it was picked up by the publisher Picador, and it went on. When it was finally published, it hit like a thunderbolt. It racked up all kinds of rewards across the world, including the special award at the New South Wales Premier Literary Awards. And it took the General Nonfiction Book of the Year award at the Australian Book Industry Awards. And most prestigiously, it took the Victorian Prize for Literature and the Victorian's Premier Prize for Nonfiction. Writing for the Times Literary Supplement, the journalist Louise Clee notes that in a decade of Australian politics defined by the leadership spill, a split decade in which any meaningful progress on the issues that define Australia, be it Indigenous affairs, refugee politics, or climate change, effectively stalled, Behrouz Boochani's witnessing has elevated him to a paradoxical position. Today, he may well be the most significant political voice in a country he has never visited. What was the reception like for you personally, especially seeing how you remained in prison on Manus Island?
Of course, it's paradoxical. It's very paradoxical that when you even didn't visit that country, but you have a voice, you have a platform, and no one give you that platform. You created that platform through your resistance. And that is paradoxical because they introduce refugees as dangerous people. I mean, in Australia, rapists, drug dealers, potential terrorists. These words they used for refugees. And I think in my case, I am just a symbol for refugees who were banished to an island and they challenge the system by their resistance. So I'm just a part of it. I'm just a symbol of that resistance. But of course, it's paradoxical.
I'm fascinated to how the body of your work all does come together, and the description that you offered of how the book itself is just part of that package and all of the things that you wanted to say. In terms of pure artistry as voice, the various paths that you're using to express are just fantastic. And when it comes to that, you have that whole body of work. You've done a whole body of interviews. And I find myself feeling inadequate and not at all creative in the questions I've asked. I feel like I've fallen short. And so a question that I do want to put your way is, having done so many of these interviews yourself, having put out your whole body of work, what's the thing that I missed today? What should I have asked you? What do you want to share that I didn't open the door for you?
Of course, it's not easy to talk about that when you are able to write many books about that system, when you are able to make many movies about that. Of course, you cannot ask all of the questions in just an hour or 2 hours. But I think your questions were great because sometimes people ask some question that those questions make me tired because I answered those questions for many years. Yeah, the reason I say that because of course you become tired when you answer a same question for many years. Just imagine you first time you went to university and people ask that question from you. How was your first day? in university. So you should answer that for many years. Of course, that makes you tired. Yeah.
I've found people have a tendency to pick up a thing about one's life and make that the thing that is their life. And I'm hearing from you, you had an experience that many people, myself included, are tempted to look at and say, well, that's Behrouz. That experience is Behrouz, but there's so much more, and there's so much more to come. Behrouz, you have such a rich body of work behind you across a spectrum of media. And I'm curious, what's next for you looking ahead?
Yeah, we have done some works. Just recently, we published a book. I shared it on Twitter. I and Omid and Janet and Ani Abdil. So 4 editors. We published a book a few weeks ago, and I just shared it on Twitter so people can go and see it.
It's a powerful collaborative team. Yeah, I mean, the work that you've all done together and continue to do that's a marvelous combination of people.
Yeah, I think so. But that is the academic work. But for me, I myself, I'm just working on some fiction stories.
I look forward to reading those.
It's not about Manus, it's not about refugees. Different work.
Behrouz, this has been an honor. This has been a conversation that I've personally been looking forward to and dreading for a year now. The opportunity to speak to someone like yourself, someone who sacrificed their lives for 6 years for a better future, someone who represents a story of millions of refugees around the world, each with compelling stories like your own. And I would like to thank you for the triumph of No Friends But the Mountains. It's not only your stories you pointed out, it's the story of countless displaced people around the world today in the Middle East, in the Americas, in the Far East, all seeking a better future and all deserving an opportunity to seek that better future. I think that your book is a tremendous universal appeal to the value of human rights and to the need to confront the human challenge, the human tragedy of displaced people, of imprisoned people around the world. I'd also like to make a note that the book that you're referring to is Writing Through Fences, Archipelago of Letters. It was just published recently through the Southerly University of New South Wales, I believe, UNSW. Yeah. And so I will be sure to include a link in all the various outlets for this interview so people can both seek out No Friends But the Mountains and your latest collaboration, Writing Through Fences. And I also, as a fellow artist, understand that now that you have won your freedom, you now want your artistic freedom to be able to move past the experience of being a prisoner and to explore different characters, different worlds, and different stories of yours that you find of interest. And I, as a reader of yours, cannot wait to see where you go next as an artist. And I commend you for wanting to seize that freedom and not be locked into the identity of the prisoner from Manus Island.
Oh, thank you very much. That thing I am doing. Yeah, but of course, the academic works continue because I think Manus is not a simple context. I cannot get away of that. It's 6 years of my life now. But of course, I don't identify myself with that. I am more than that. World is bigger.
Yeah.
The world is bigger. And for those listening, I encourage you to seek out No Friends But the Mountains. It's available through Amazon and through all your favorite bookstores across the world. It's been published in 30 different languages and will soon be a major feature film in the next coming years. Behrouz Boochani, I would like to thank you for your time. I'd like to thank you for your sacrifice. I'd like to thank you for your voice. It was a true honor having you on The Ask.
Thank you. Thank you very much.